Your salary is a trap, and not in the way motivational content usually means it. This is a literal engineered structure designed to feel like the safest decision you ever made, while it quietly consumes the one resource you can never recover: the actual hours of your life. Stay until the end, because the final revelation here is not a punchline. It is a structural truth that will change the way you read every paycheck from this moment forward. Here is what nobody explains when you sign the employment contract. Right now, somewhere in the world, a person is waking up before they are ready, in an apartment they selected based on what their salary would allow, getting dressed in a way that signals professional seriousness to people they did not choose to spend their day with, and driving through traffic to trade hours of irreplaceable human consciousness for a number that someone else decided was fair. That person is not imprisoned by law. They are imprisoned by an agreement they entered voluntarily, usually around 22 years old, with almost no real understanding of what they were consenting to or how long the consent would last. The feudal system of medieval Japan did not bother dressing itself up. The peasant worked the land. The lord took most of what the land produced and returned just enough rice to ensure the peasant could return and do it again the following season. Nobody called that a career path or framed it as an opportunity for growth. The extraction was visible and everyone understood the transaction. What shifted in the modern era was not the underlying structure, but the language wrapped around it. The extraction is now called compensation. The lord is now called an employer. The rice stipend now comes with a dental plan. And the most dangerous evolution in this version of the arrangement is that the person inside it now believes, with genuine conviction, that they freely chose it, and that choosing it was wise. The samurai tradition did not celebrate dependence on a lord's provision. It viewed a warrior whose survival was entirely contingent on someone else's continued goodwill as strategically compromised in a way that no amount of skill could fully compensate for, because at the decisive moment, the dependency would override the discipline. The comfort cage was not assembled quickly. It was refined across decades through the careful study of how people respond to incremental change, and its most effective design feature is that every time it tightens, the tightening feels from the inside like an upgrade. Here is what actually happens on payday, the real sequence rather than the theory. The notification arrives. There is a brief, almost physical surge of relief, the kind that feels like exhaling after holding your breath for 3 weeks. And then, before that feeling fully settles, the subtractions have already occurred. The rent cleared 2 days ago. The car payment settled this morning. The streaming services, the gym membership used 4 times last month, the software subscription nobody canceled in the spring of last year, all of it moved silently in the background while you were at work producing the income that funded it. Whatever remains after all of that is smaller than it felt when the total number first appeared, and that smaller remainder gets absorbed by groceries. The dinner on Friday that genuinely felt earned after the week you had. The purchase made at 11 at night when the algorithm surfaced exactly what exhaustion tends to want. The month ends. The cycle resets. This happens across essentially every income bracket the system touches, and it is not primarily because people are irresponsible. The system was calibrated to produce this outcome. Lifestyle expansion tracks earnings with an accuracy that should disturb anyone who notices it. The person earning $50,000 and the person earning $150,000 are both, statistically, living within spending range of whatever they make. When the raise arrives, the apartment gets nicer. When the promotion comes through, the vehicle gets newer. The cage scales upward at exactly the rate required to ensure no meaningful surplus ever persists long enough to become what the system most needs it not to become, which is the financial foundation of independence. Stop for a moment. Think about the last time your financial position shifted in a structural sense, not a number incrementally increasing, but a genuine rearrangement of how your resources were actually deployed, and toward what end. Most people cannot identify that moment because it has not happened. The Ronin was socially despised in feudal Japan, and the intensity of that contempt is worth examining because it tells you something about the psychology of systems built on dependency. A samurai without a master, surviving entirely through skill and adaptability, was not just an outlier. He was evidence that the arrangement everyone else had accepted was a choice rather than a law of nature. He was not necessarily more capable than the retained warriors around him. What he had was the absence of a specific vulnerability, and that absence threatened the entire logic that kept the retained warriors compliant, which is why the system needed to frame masterlessness as failure. The alternative framing was too destabilizing to permit. Inflation is what makes the salary trap self-reinforcing from the inside out. You receive a 3% raise in a year when real purchasing power declined by 5%, and you feel, genuinely and physically, that you advanced. Musashi wrote in the Book of Five Rings that the warrior must learn to perceive what cannot be seen with the eyes, and there is almost nothing less visible in daily experience than the slow erosion of what your money actually buys. Nobody sends a notification. Nothing looks obviously different on a Tuesday morning. You just find, across years, that the same life costs measurably more, and the income that once felt like sufficient ground has been gradually reclassifying itself as something that barely covers the baseline. When did you last calculate your actual purchasing capability versus 5 years ago? The real, functional ability to acquire and build, not the number on the payslip. Most people leave that calculation undone because the honest result is uncomfortable enough to warrant avoiding. Drop a comment right now and tell us what city you are watching from. Because this architecture functions identically in Chicago and Berlin and São Paulo and Manila, the surface details vary. The underlying mechanism does not. After Sekigahara in 1600, thousands of samurai found themselves masterless within a matter of weeks, their stipends dissolved by the collapse of their lord's political position. What happened to most of them reveals something about the nature of dependency that no formal financial education has ever communicated with this level of precision. They could not adapt, and the reason was not a lack of skill or intelligence. The dependency had not been purely financial. It had been structural and psychological, meaning their entire sense of what they were capable of doing, what decisions were available to them, what kind of future was possible, had been organized around a specific arrangement. When the arrangement dissolved, so did their internal map of themselves as independent actors. Think about someone you know who spent a decade or more at the same organization. They became genuinely expert at the internal systems, the informal decision-making pathways, the unwritten relational rules that never appear in any org chart. They optimized extensively for that specific environment. And then a Tuesday morning meeting with no listed agenda produces a 30-minute conversation with someone from HR, and the role is gone as part of a strategic restructuring. All of that accumulated contextual expertise, all of the embedded knowledge that felt like a professional asset, turns out to be largely non-portable. It served one specific environment that no longer exists. The samurai standing outside the castle gates in 1601 would have recognized that experience with uncomfortable clarity. A subset of those displaced warriors chose a different trajectory entirely. They became instructors, strategic advisors, craftsmen, people who took the same underlying discipline and redirected it toward building things that belonged to them rather than to a lord structure. Musashi operated this way through most of his mature life, refusing permanent lord affiliation at considerable personal and material cost, maintaining freedom of strategic action as the priority above comfort or institutional protection. The chapter on the void in the Book of Five Rings tends to get treated as philosophical padding by readers looking for tactical content, but what Musashi was actually describing was operational. The void is the functional white space that only exists inside a resource pool that is not completely consumed by prior obligations. When every dollar and every hour is already allocated to maintenance of the existing arrangement, that space disappears, and with it goes the practical capacity to perceive or move toward anything structurally different. The economy does not need you to achieve financial freedom. It needs you to remain financially functional enough to keep consuming reliably. A workforce whose entire income is absorbed by its own maintenance will show up consistently because the alternative is genuinely terrifying, and that consistency is the actual product being purchased by the employment arrangement. You are not primarily employed to produce what your job title describes. You are employed because your dependency makes your labor priceable at institutional discretion. If this is cutting through, give the video a like. That small action is worth more than it appears. The samurai clans that survived Sekigahara's political restructuring were not the ones that had accumulated the largest prior stipends. They were the ones that had quietly developed parallel systems, land arrangements, trade networks, specialized craft capabilities. things that kept producing value regardless of which political configuration was currently dominant. Compounding requires something that persists beyond the individual transaction. A skill deployed once earns once. A system built around a skill generates in your absence, and the difference between those two outcomes, sustained across years, is the entire distance between dependency and autonomy. Most people will spend their entire working lives inside a single category of effort without ever being clearly told that a second category exists, and the omission is worth examining rather than assuming it is accidental. The first category is effort that earns once and then resets. The work is performed, the compensation arrives, the compensation is spent on the maintenance of the life built around receiving that compensation, and the sequence must begin again from zero to produce more. Every hour of salaried labor in recorded history belongs in this category. The moment the labor stops, the income stops, and the arrangement was always exactly that, structurally fragile underneath whatever employment benefits were wrapped around it. The second category builds something that continues operating after the initial effort is complete. A consulting capability developed from genuine expertise. A content library that reaches people without requiring your active presence in each individual exchange. An ownership position in something productive. The honest version of this path is not passive or effortless in the way a lot of financial content suggests. It requires more sustained and disciplined initial effort than the salaried arrangement does. What it produces over time is a structure that compounds rather than resets. Here is where Jung's thinking becomes unexpectedly practical. He spent decades studying the psychological territory people hide from themselves rather than from others, the parts of their self-concept that operate below conscious awareness, shaping decisions and reactions in ways the person would often strongly deny. In the context of financial psychology, what tends to live in that unexamined territory for the long-term salaried worker is something that rarely gets spoken aloud. The salary was never only income. It was external confirmation that they were valuable, competent, legitimate as a professional person. The job title was never simply a description of function. It was the answer to the question of who they were when someone asked. Take away the institutional structure that provides that confirmation, and many people discover, sometimes with genuine shock, that they have no internal mechanism for assessing their own worth in its absence. The dependency was never limited to the financial layer. This is not a character flaw. It is the predictable result of an educational and professional system that evaluated people externally from childhood through adulthood without interruption. Grades, performance reviews, salary bands, promotion timelines, annual assessment cycles. Decades of that architecture produces people who have been trained to seek external validation of their value as a default operating mode. Not because they chose that mode consciously, but because no alternative was ever presented as available or respectable. Nietzsche's concept of self-overcoming tends to get misread as being about dominance or aggression. But what he was actually writing about was the act of reclaiming self-definition from whatever external authority you had gradually surrendered it to, often without noticing the surrender was happening. The specific moment when a person stops needing an institutional structure to confirm what they are worth is the moment their negotiating position in the economy permanently changes, because they are no longer operating from the unacknowledged anxiety of someone who needs the arrangement to continue in order to know who they are. Getting out of the architecture of economic dependency is not a single event. It is a sequence of small, precise, structural choices made consistently over a stretch of time that requires more patience than most people have been trained to exercise. Stop treating income as the goal and start treating it as raw material. Every dollar that arrives is either being deployed toward building something that will persist after you, or it is being fed back into the maintenance machine that keeps the dependency running. There is no genuinely neutral position between those two outcomes. Sakamoto Ryoma grew up in a Japan where the existing social order was not presented as a policy preference that could be examined and revised through public debate. It was presented as the structure of reality, as self-evident and permanent as the shape of the coastline. His samurai rank defined his economic position, his legally permitted occupations, his social standing, and the realistic range of his future, all in advance, all through a system he had not designed and had not been asked to consent to. Most people around him treated the shogunate the way most people today treat the employment economy, as the natural condition of things, something to navigate as skillfully as possible rather than something to examine structurally. He examined it anyway, and what he found was not that the system was uniquely malevolent. His conclusion was more operationally precise and more threatening to the arrangement than a moral critique would have been. He concluded that the shogunate's power was held in place primarily by the collective belief in its permanence, not by its military force alone, not by its administrative efficiency, but by the shared psychological assumption that this was simply how Japan worked and would continue working. He spent the final years of his life working to dissolve that assumption, building coordination across clan divisions the system had deliberately maintained, operating as a masterless strategic agent through a world structured around the requirement that every person of capability must be attached to and dependent on an institutional authority. He was killed in 1867. Months before the revolution, he helped architect produced its visible results. The Meiji Restoration that followed and reshaped Japan's entire economic and social structure was built substantially on the groundwork Ryoma laid by refusing, at real personal cost, to treat the arrangement as inevitable. The corporate employment structure in its current form requires workforce financial fragility to function at maximum institutional efficiency. A workforce with genuine financial reserves and genuine alternatives is a workforce that can negotiate from a position of real leverage, and labor that can negotiate on its own terms cannot be priced at institutional discretion. The dependency is not a side effect of how the system was built. It is one of the primary design features. Your first practical move is not the dramatic exit. The samurai approaching a fortified position did not begin by charging the gate. He studied the terrain carefully, identified the viable angles of approach, mapped the available retreat options, and moved only when the full geometry of the situation was understood well enough that the action had a reasonable basis. Your first move is to redirect a defined percentage of the next paycheck toward something you own outright. A skill you are developing, a system you are building, an asset that does not require your current employer's continued existence or goodwill in order to retain its value. Start at whatever percentage the current structure honestly allows without triggering financial panic. 5% is a legitimate beginning if that is the real number. The size is less significant than the direction and the consistency of the practice, because what you are actually training is not a savings behavior. You are beginning the process of reconstructing your self-concept from a person who receives value externally to a person who generates it independently, and that shift, once it takes hold, changes the frame from which every subsequent financial decision gets made. Musashi wrote that the way of strategy is the way of nature, meaning not aggression, not exhausting sustained effort grinding against friction, but alignment thorough enough that when the decisive moment arrives, the action does not feel like a difficult choice. It feels like the only available response to the conditions that have been carefully prepared for. You have known for longer than you have let yourself acknowledge that something in the arrangement is structurally wrong. That recognition is not anxiety or ingratitude or a failure of professional commitment. It is the strategic part of your intelligence doing its actual job, identifying a pattern that the rest of your conditioning has been trained to dismiss because the pattern is uncomfortable and because acting on it requires carrying the weight of your own autonomy before any outcome has confirmed that the weight was worth bearing. The people who built lasting financial independence were not the ones who waited for the system to create favorable conditions for them to leave. They were the ones who started building before the permission arrived, before the outcome was guaranteed, before the people around them understood what was being constructed. Subscribe and walk with us, because this path does not end here. It has only just found solid ground beneath it.